Have you ever been listening to music, just grooving along, and then bam, this thought hits you? Why does this particular combo of sounds really get to me? Why does it make me feel this way? Kind of a weird question when you really think
It
about it.
is, isn't it? It's like music can bypass all this logical thinking and just boom, straight to the emotions.
Yeah, exactly. So today we're going to tap into that kind of instinctive curiosity we all have about music.
Yeah.
We're going deep, really deep, into how some of history's heaviest hitters, philosophers from way back in ancient Greece up through the 1700s, how they grappled with that very question. Think of this as like a crash course. Centuries of mind-blowing ideas about music, but without all the, dusty textbooks and stuff.
Yeah, no lectures here. We've been poring over this, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It's their entry on the history of Western philosophy of music, Antiquity to 1800, and let me tell you, it's been a wild ride.
I bet. So what have you unearthed so far? What's the big takeaway?
The thing is, these philosophers, they didn't just see music as entertainment. I mean, they did, but they also saw it as this, window into the universe. Like, it held clues to the cosmos, to our ethics, to our emotions, to how societies work, the whole shebang.
Wow, that's huge. It's not just about the notes, it's about the why behind the music.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's fire up the time machine and head back to, I guess, ancient Greece. Where does this whole philosophical journey into music even begin? What were the early thinkers obsessed with?
Okay, so picture this. Ancient Greece, you've got these philosophers, right? And they come up with two really big ideas about music. The first is, super cosmic. They believed music was a reflection of the universe, its structure mirrored the order of the cosmos. And then the second idea was all about, ethics. It's called ethos theory. It basically said that music had a direct impact on your character, on your emotions, on who you were as a person.
I love that. It's like the universe is singing and we're part of the choir, right?
I kind of.
All right, so let's dig into that first cosmic idea, the harmony of the spheres. It sounds so mystical and cool. What was the deal with Pythagoras and all that?
Okay, so Pythagoras and his crew, they were all about harmony, but not just in the musical sense. They believed harmony was this, universal principle. It governed everything from the stars and planets to, our souls. And the key to this harmony, math, numbers.
So musical scales and ratios.
Exactly. They were obsessed with those ratios in music, the octave, 2-to-1, the fifth, 3-to-2, the fourth, 4-to-3. And they had this sacred symbol, the tetractys, which represented the first four numbers arranged in a triangle. They saw all these numbers and ratios as reflections of the universe's hidden structure. Like the cosmos was singing a mathematical song, even if we couldn't hear it with our ears. They called it, the harmony of the spheres. It's like this cosmic orchestra playing all the time, but silently. And the monochord, that one-stringed instrument, it's really connected to these Pythagorean discoveries about musical ratios. Though, to be honest, we're not totally sure if Pythagoras himself actually used it. But the idea is music was this tangible link to the fundamental order of the universe.
I mean, wow. Talk about seeing music on a grand scale. That's not just enjoying a tune. That's like feeling connected to the fabric of reality.
Right. It's pretty wild.
But didn't Aristotle have, some issues with this whole cosmic music idea? He seemed a bit more, down to earth.
Oh, he totally did. Aristotle was like, hold on a second, let's be real here. He was much more of an empiricist. He looked at the world around him and said, okay, numbers, they're cool and all, but they don't have weight, right? They're abstract. So how can the physical universe be made of something non-physical?
Good point.
And then he went on to say, look, we know that sound has real physical effects. You bang a drum loud enough, you can break things. So if these giant planets are constantly moving and making sounds, shouldn't we be feeling that? Shouldn't it be, shaking things up here on Earth?
Yeah, I guess so.
The fact that we don't, Aristotle argued, meant that those planets probably weren't making any audible music. He also wasn't buying the whole idea of the soul being just a form of harmony. So yeah, Aristotle definitely brought a more grounded scientific perspective to the table.
I can see how those two approaches would clash. So did Aristotle's critique kind of shift the way philosophers thought about music?
It definitely led to some interesting splits in thinking. On the one hand, you had the Pythagorean tradition continuing on. Thinkers like Philolaus, Archytas, even Euclid and his Sectio Canonis and Nicomachus, they were all about understanding music through those mathematical ratios. But then you had this other group, led by Aristoxenus, who were more focused on the actual experience of music. They said, look, music is about what we hear, how it's made, how it's perceived by trained listeners, not just some abstract mathematical formula.
So it's like one group was looking at the blueprint, the math behind the music, and the other group was like listening to the actual performance, the experience of it.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And it's a debate that's still relevant today. How do we explain aesthetic experience? Do we search for those hidden structures, or do we trust our senses the way we perceive things?
Right, right. It makes you think about how you approach music, you know?
Mhm.
Do you analyze it, break it down, or just let it wash over you?
Totally. And it's interesting, even back then, people were aware of this split. Ptolemais, a music theorist, she actually made a distinction between the Mosychoi, who were like the Aristoxenians, focused on the ear, and the Canonicoi, who were more like the Pythagoreans, focused on mathematical rules.
So even then, they were categorizing different ways of thinking about music.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got these two, like, totally different approaches, the cosmic harmony folks and the experience focus folks. But were there any philosophers who tried to, like, bridge the gap, find some kind of middle ground?
Yeah, totally. Some tried to synthesize these different ideas. Ptolemy himself, while still a Pythagorean at heart and totally believing in cosmic harmony, he also wanted to make those mathematical frameworks more relevant to, how music actually worked in practice. He was trying to bring those two worlds together. And then there's Aristides Quintilianus. He was a really fascinating figure. He was influenced by Aristophanes' focus on perception, but he also built this whole, cosmic framework around music, drawing all these parallels between musical elements and like the cosmos and human nature.
Yeah.
He was all about music's ethical value, even saying that it was better than other art forms at imitating moral actions because it used both words and melody. He even went so far as to classify musical elements as masculine or feminine, to explain their ethical effects. It was a whole system he created.
Wow, that's like a total worldview built around music.
It is.
Okay, so we've explored how the ancient Greeks connected music to the universe, to our ethics. But what about, like, the more immediate impact of music, like how it makes us feel, its role in society, all that stuff? What did bigwigs like Plato and Aristotle have to say about that?
Oh, they definitely had thoughts. But first, it's super important to remember that when Plato and Aristotle talked about musiko, they weren't just talking about tunes and melodies. Their concept was way broader.
Oh, okay.
It included instruments, singing poetry, even dance and movement. It was like this total art form combining sound, words, and gesture.
So it was more about the whole performance, the context, not just the sound itself.
Exactly. And Plato, he was convinced that this musico had a massive impact on education and society. He was really worried about shifts in musical taste. He thought changes in music could actually lead to social and political upheaval. He even pointed to how music changed after the Persian Wars and said that contributed to later unrest, which he talks about in his laws. And in his Republic, Plato saw art in general, including music, as a kind of imitation of the physical world, which he believed was just a pale copy of the realm of perfect forms, like these ideal blueprints for everything.
So art was a copy of a copy, basically.
Yep. And that meant it wasn't really that valuable for gaining true knowledge. Plato was a little wary of art leading us astray from, real truth.
Right, so Plato wasn't exactly a huge fan of the arts if they were just, cheap imitations.
Well, it's complicated. He did believe that music could be really powerful in shaping people's characters, especially young people. But he thought it had to be carefully controlled, to promote virtue and all that. He believed that certain musical modes, like the Dorian and Phrygian modes, were good at imitating virtuous emotions, like courage and moderation. He even suggested that since the soul, music, and the cosmos all shared this underlying harmonic structure, music could directly influence a person's character. Although this kind of contradicts some of his other ideas about the soul. So Plato was a bit of a mixed bag, wary of art's power to mislead, but also recognizing its potential for good.
So cautious optimism.
Pretty much.
Okay, and how about Aristotle? Did he have a different take on music and emotions?
Yeah, he did. Aristotle agreed that music imitates emotions, but he had a more positive view of imitation overall. He saw it as a natural human thing, like it's how we learn and experience pleasure, even if the thing we're imitating isn't so pleasant.
So, we enjoy watching scary movies, even though we wouldn't want to actually be chased by a monster.
Exactly. And Aristotle made this key distinction. He said that music doesn't just show signs of emotions, like a painting of someone crying, which is just a sign of sadness. It actually imitates the emotions themselves. Music can actually make you feel sad or happy or whatever emotion it's imitating. So for Plato, imitation was potentially misleading. But for Aristotle, it was a way to learn and engage with emotions.
So it's not just depicting the emotion, it's actually evoking it within us.
Exactly. And Aristotle thought this was really important for education. He believed that listening to music that imitated virtuous emotions could actually make people more virtuous themselves. It's like by experiencing those emotions through music, we can cultivate them in our own lives. He also introduced this idea of catharsis, which means that music can help us purify or balance out strong emotions.
So like listening to sad music can actually help us process our own sadness.
Yeah, kind of. And when it came to pleasure, Aristotle thought musical pleasure was good in itself, not just as a tool for, like, moral improvement. He saw it as part of living a good life. And he was also more open to instrumental music than Plato. He thought that music without words could still evoke emotions through its melody and rhythm. So overall, Aristotle had a much more positive view of music's role in human life.
He sounds like a fun guy to have at a party.
Probably.
Okay, so both Plato and Aristotle saw music as this like powerful force that could shape us ethically and emotionally. But were there any ancient philosophers who like weren't totally convinced? Any skeptics out there?
Oh, yeah, definitely. There were some voices saying, hold on, maybe music isn't this magical ethical tool. Philodemus, he was an Epicurean. He thought the whole idea of music imitating passions was ridiculous. He compared it to cooking, basically saying it just provides a kind of superficial pleasure. He even used Democritus to back him up, although, to be fair, we don't have a ton of Democritus's writings on music. And then there was Sextus Empiricus, famous for his skepticism. He questioned whether music had any real educational value at all. He said we can enjoy music without understanding it, again, making that comparison to, enjoying a good meal without being a chef. So not everyone in ancient Greece was on board with the whole music as moral guidance thing.
Makes sense. I mean, not everyone gets all philosophical when they listen to
Yep.
music, right?
Right.
So what happened next in this philosophical journey? Let's fast forward a bit. What about the Middle Ages? Did they come up with like totally new ideas about music?
Okay, so we're talking like 1,000 years here. And to be honest, it wasn't as innovative a period for Western philosophy of music compared to those ancient Greek trailblazers. But obviously, the biggest thing that happened was, the rise of Christianity.
Makes sense.
And Christian thinkers, they took some of those classical ideas like the harmony of the spheres and ethos theory and kind of adapted them to fit their own beliefs. But the main focus shifted towards music theory as a science, with less emphasis on, like, the pleasure of music and the role of the composer or performer. It became more about, like, the technical stuff.
So it went from music as an art form to music as like a mathematical puzzle to be solved.
Yeah, pretty much. St. Augustine, for example, he defined music as the science of mensurating well. Like, it was all about proportions and order. He did recognize music's power in religious worship, but he also personally struggled with the sensory pleasure of it. He worried it would distract people from, like, the spiritual message.
That's interesting. And then there's Boethius, super influential guy. He basically transmitted a lot of those Greek ideas into the Middle Ages. He came up with these three categories of music. Musica mundana was the harmony of the cosmos, but understood in a Christian way. Musica humana was the harmony within the human body and soul. And musica instrumentalis was the actual music we hear, made by instruments and voices. But guess what? He thought that last category, the music we actually hear, was the least important of the three.
Wow, that's a total flip from how we think about music today. Like, imagine telling a musician that the sounds they create are the least important part of music.
I know, right?
Okay, so music became more theoretical, more scientific. But what about that idea of music of ethical influence? Did that stick around in Christian thought? It did, in a way. The Christian interpretation of ethos theory focused more on music's ability to inspire devotion and, like, uplift people spiritually. That whole idea of music influencing character was still around, sometimes even amplified by those, kind of legendary stories about music's power from ancient times. But there were some pushbacks, too. Albert the Great, for example, he rejected the whole literal idea of celestial harmony based on his understanding of physics and the universe.
So even within the church, there were different interpretations.
Yeah.
Okay, and how did music fit into the whole, like, academic world of the Middle Ages? Where did it belong in their system of knowledge?
Music was part of the seven liberal arts, specifically in the quadrivium. That was the group of, like, math-focused subjects, along with arithmetic, geometry, and astronomy. And this placement, it came from that whole Pythagorean Boethian idea of music being about ratios and harmony. It was seen as a mathematical science. But of course, there were debates about this. Some people thought music was more than just numbers.
Makes sense.
Over time, people started paying more attention to the practical and acoustic aspects of music, too. Theorists like John of Garland and even Thomas Aquinas, they talked about music in those terms. And we can't forget about the influence of Islamic philosophy during this time. Thinkers like Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, and Ibn Sina, they were drawing on those same Greek sources, but they were also really interested in the sensory and emotional experience of music. Al-Farabi, for example, he flat out rejected cosmic harmony and focused on music as a human thing, something that could evoke images and emotions in the mind, kind of like Aristotle's idea of musical imitation.
So Islamic philosophers were bringing a different perspective to the table.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so we've got the Middle Ages preserving and reinterpreting those ancient ideas with some new twists. Now let's jump ahead to the early modern period. This is where things get really interesting, right? A whole new focus on the experience of music, the emotions, the senses.
Totally. Starting around the 15th century, there's this clear shift towards appreciating music for how it makes us feel, for the sensory pleasure it provides.
So like less about the math and more about the feels.
Exactly. Guys like Johannes Tinctoris, he started defining concepts like harmony and consonance based on how they actually sound to the ear, how they affect the listener. He totally recognized that music could have powerful emotional effects. And Zarlino, another big-time music theorist in the 16th century, he still valued the mathematical side of music, but he said that the ultimate goal of all those rules and theories was to serve beauty, to improve the music, and to delight the listener.
Delight the listener, I like that.
Yeah, it's a much more like experience-focused approach.
And this is also when opera was born, right? With the Florentine Camerata and all that drama.
Oh yeah, the Camerata. They were this group of intellectuals, poets, musicians, hanging out in Florence in the late 1500s. They were kind of bummed about the state of music at the time. They thought it was too complex, too technical, not emotionally engaging enough.
So too much head, not enough heart.
Pretty much, they looked back at ancient Greek music drama and thought, hey, that stuff was powerful. It really moved people. And they wanted to bring back that emotional impact. So they came up with this style of singing called monody, which is basically a single melodic line with simple accompaniment. The idea was to imitate the natural rhythms of speech, to create this really expressive, direct way of singing.
So it's like heightened speech, almost like musical storytelling.
Yeah, exactly. And it was designed to evoke specific emotions in the audience. They called it style rappresentativo. And that's basically how opera was born. Monteverdi's L'Orfeo was a huge example of this style.
So it sounds like a pretty radical shift.
Yeah.
But I'm guessing not everyone was thrilled about this new emotional, dramatic style of music.
Oh, you know it. Some people were like, whoa, hold up. What about the rules? What about tradition? Giovanni Maria Artusi, a music theorist, he was a big defender of the old way of doing things, the prima pratica. He believed in sticking to those established rules, keeping music rational and, grounded in tradition. He thought this new expressive style, the seconda pratica, was sacrificing musical integrity for the sake of, cheap thrills.
So a clash of the titans, old school versus new school.
Totally. Even Zerlino, who had been Galileo's teacher, he had some reservations. He argued that imitating speech was more of a rhetoric thing, not a music thing. He thought music should focus on expressing the meaning of the text through harmony, not just mimicking how it's spoken. This whole debate also brought up the question of melody versus harmony, which was more important for conveying emotions. But in the end, there was this growing agreement that, at least for vocal music, the text was king. The words should be clear, understandable, and the music should serve them.
So a lot of drama and debate, but ultimately a shift towards recognizing the importance of emotional expression in music. But were those mathematical, rational aspects of music completely forgotten?
Nope, not at all. Guys like Marin Mersenne were still digging deep into the mathematical foundations of music. He was convinced that there was this deep connection between the math of music and the structure of the universe.
The Harmony of the Spheres, Part 2.
Kind of. He spent a lot of time exploring the relationship between mathematical consonants, those nice-sounding intervals, and our subjective experience of them as agreeable. And Descartes, in his early work on music, he was also coming at it from a scientific perspective, analyzing sounds and their physical properties, but he also acknowledged that the ultimate goal of music was to, quote, please and arouse various affections in us. His later work on emotions, the passions of the soul, had a big influence on the affectin layer that developed in the 18th century, this idea that music should evoke specific emotions through, musical formulas and techniques. And Leibniz, he also thought that music's main purpose was to move the listener, but he believed that the pleasure we get from music comes from, like, unconsciously perceiving the rational structure of the universe.
That's a trippy thought.
Mm.
So even with all this emphasis on emotion and experience, the rational scientific side of music was still very much alive.
Yeah, it was this constant back and forth, this tension between the senses and the intellect.
Okay, so we're cruising into the 18th century now. This is when instrumental music really takes off, right? Complex symphonies, concertos, all that good stuff.
Yeah.
How did philosophers deal with that? Especially the whole question of imitation, if instrumental music wasn't really imitating anything specific.
Yeah, this is where things get really interesting. Instrumental music was becoming so important, so complex, that it just didn't make sense to say that music's main job was to imitate voices or sounds from the real world. So people started questioning the whole idea of imitation. Charles Avison, for example, he drew a clear line between imitation, which he saw as like a literal resemblance to something outside of music, and expression, which was music's ability to like evoke feelings and emotions through its own internal language.
So music can be powerful and moving without having to sound like a bird or a thunderstorm or whatever.
Yes, exactly. But the 18th century was still really influenced by that whole idea of art as imitation, so theorists tried to find ways to make it work with instrumental music. Beteau, for example, he defined art as the imitation of beautiful nature. And he said that music imitated the expression of emotions in humans, even though he sometimes used the word expresses instead of imitates, which kind of shows how things were changing. Dubos, he was another imitation guy. He said that vocal music imitated speech and instrumental music imitated sounds from nature. But as the century went on, especially in France, you see more and more pushback against this whole imitation thing. Morellet, Boyer, and especially Chabanon, they all challenged the idea that imitation was necessary for music to be effective. Chabanon pointed out that even little kids who don't understand what music is supposed to be imitating can still respond to it emotionally. And he said that even people from different cultures who've never heard a certain type of music before can still be moved by it. So clearly there's something more to music than just imitation. He also argued that music could express emotions that don't have any, like, obvious external counterpart in the real world.
So like a feeling that doesn't have a corresponding sound in nature.
Yeah, exactly. So the focus was shifting towards this idea of music having its own internal expressive power, independent of any external reference points.
That's a big step. So what was happening in England and Germany during this time? Were they having similar debates?
Yeah, very similar. In England, you had Francis Hutcheson, who distinguished between what he called original beauty, which was inherent in music itself, like the melody, harmony, rhythm, all that, and comparative beauty, which was about how closely music resembled something else, like speech, and how it could evoke empathy in the listener. William Webb, he got into the whole physiological side of things, exploring how music actually affects our bodies and brains. He thought it could work through both imitation and direct impressions on our nervous system. James Beattie straight up questioned whether imitation was even necessary for music. He said a good piece of music doesn't always have to be a good imitation of something else.
Mm.
And then there's Thomas Reid. He offered this idea of musical expression as natural signs. He basically said that music can directly produce feelings in us without us having to learn anything or recognize what's being imitated. So he was downplaying imitation quite a bit. Even Adam Smith, the economist, he chimed in on aesthetics too. He differentiated between vocal and instrumental music, saying that while vocal music could be enjoyable because of its successful imitation, most instrumental music didn't really imitate anything. He suggested that instrumental music's power might lie in its ability to evoke a general feeling or mood, like how a landscape can make you feel melancholic.
That's a cool way to put it. So like music can create an atmosphere, a feeling, without having to specifically depict anything.
Yeah, exactly. And in Germany, you had similar trends. Johann Georg Sulzer, he was still kind of old school, believing that music mainly imitated speech. But Johann Mattheson, a big proponent of the Effektenlehre, he focused more on how music could physically arouse specific emotions in the listener, linking certain musical patterns to particular feelings. And then there was Johann Gottfried Herder, who had a more holistic view. He thought music fundamentally imitated motion and sound, emphasizing its, like, unfolding over time. He wasn't really into those purely mathematical or physical explanations of music. He was more focused on how it affected us physically and emotionally.
So lots of different ideas, but a general move away from strict imitation.
Yeah.
And of course, we can't forget about Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He was a huge music lover, and he had some very strong opinions, especially about melody.
Oh, yeah, Rousseau. He was passionately involved in this big debate called the Querelle des Bouffons, where he basically trashed French opera and championed Italian opera, mainly because he thought melody was the key to musical expression. He totally disagreed with Rameau, the leading French music theorist at the time. He thought French music was too focused on harmony and that it actually hindered true emotional expression.
So he was team melody all the way.
All the way. He believed in the unity of melody, meaning that the main focus should be on a clear, expressive melodic line that directly moves a listener. Harmony was secondary, its job was just to support the melody.
It sounds like he was really focused on that direct emotional connection with the music.
He was, and he had this whole theory about the origins of music and language. He thought they both came from the same, like, primal expressive urge, but then they split off, and music kind of lost some of its power along the way. He even contrasted music with philosophy, saying that music was immediate and emotional, while philosophy was more abstract and intellectual. And while he still used the word imitation, he didn't mean it in the traditional sense. He thought music didn't imitate specific sounds so much as it aroused the emotions we associate with certain things. So music could evoke, like, the feeling of night or sleep, not by literally sounding like those things, but by creating a similar feeling in the listener.
So it's more about evoking the essence of something rather than copying its sound.
Exactly. But, Rousseau being Rousseau, his ideas were controversial, and not everyone agreed with him.
I can imagine. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, from ancient Greece to the rise of opera and the debate about imitation. But we have one more big name to tackle. Immanuel Kant. He brought a whole new level of philosophical rigor to the discussion about music, especially instrumental music, right?
Oh, yeah, Kant is a big one. He's really the first major modern philosopher to systematically tackle instrumental music and try to fit it into a larger theory of aesthetics. And his ideas were super influential, especially for those who interpret music in a formalist way, focusing on its structure and form.
All right, so let's dive into Kant. What were his main ideas about music and aesthetics?
Okay, so in his Critique of Judgment, Kant made this famous distinction between the beautiful and the agreeable. The beautiful, according to Kant, evokes a kind of universal, disinterested pleasure, a pleasure that's not tied to any personal desires or preferences.
So it's not just about whether you personally like something.
Exactly. It's about whether something has a kind of inherent beauty that anyone could potentially appreciate. And this judgment of beauty, Kant said, comes from the free play of the imagination and the understanding. It's like your mind is freely exploring the form of something, and your intellect is trying to make sense of it, find patterns and connections. He thought something similar was happening when we appreciate the beauty of music.
Okay, so where does music fit into this whole beautiful versus agreeable thing?
That's where it gets a little tricky. Kant sometimes seemed to put music in the agreeable category, especially if it was just background music, like what he called tafel music, table music. But he also clearly thought that music could be a beautiful art, even ranking it up there with poetry. So it's a bit of a head-scratcher. Some scholars think that it depends on how we're engaging with the music. If we're just focused on the pleasant sounds, it's more agreeable. But if we're paying attention to its structure, its form, how it's composed, then we can experience it as beautiful. He also made this distinction between free beauty and adherent beauty. Free beauty is like purely abstract. It doesn't depend on any concept or idea.
So like a beautiful pattern or a beautiful sound just for its own sake.
Yeah, exactly. And instrumental music without any text or program, that was a prime example of free beauty for Kant. Adherent beauty, on the other hand, is tied to our understanding of what the thing is supposed to be, its purpose.
Okay, so for Kant, the real beauty of instrumental music was in its abstract form, not in whether it was representing something or telling a story.
That's the core of the formalist interpretation of Kant. He did say that the main thing we should be judging in music is its composition, the way the sounds are arranged. And he even said that music merely plays with sensations without referencing any concepts. But here's the thing. Kant also seemed to accept a version of the affected layer, the idea that music can convey emotions through, like, an analogy with the tone of human speech. So there's this tension in his thinking, which has led to a lot of different interpretations. Some people emphasize the formalist side, saying that Kant was all about the structure and form of music. Others focus on his acknowledgement of emotional expression. And some try to combine those two, saying that music's form can actually embody and express aesthetic ideas that are similar to emotions. Complicated. But one thing's clear, Kant really shifted the philosophical focus towards instrumental music as this, like, central challenge for aesthetics.
So even though he was really into form and structure, he didn't completely dismiss the emotional power of music. Wow, this has been quite a journey. We've covered so much ground, from cosmic harmony to the birth of opera to Kant's philosophy of aesthetics. It's amazing to see how these ideas about music have evolved over centuries.
Totally. And it makes you realize that how we think about music today, how we value it, it's not just some random thing. It's the result of this long, ongoing conversation that's